Okay, we're ready to start, and people will be coming in. So we are now going to hear from Betsy Kunibe, Tsiskw, Tláa, little bird lady, who, you're right, Mother Tláa. And she's talking to us about oral tradition in the U.S. Congress, the 90th U.S. Congress, Alaska Native Territory.
Okay, I guess it's on, yeah. Oh, yes, I don't know if it, yeah. My name is Mother of Little Birds because I worked as I had a foster children in an emergency shelter children. So I was adopted Kiksadi 20 years ago, and that was from that. Oh, you can't hear me? Is it on? Or?
Yeah, it's on.
Okay. Okay. Unfortunately, I had a brain injury, traumatic brain injury, and I've been in speech rehabilitation, and that's as best that I could do. Well, this is here. I don't know. I don't know if you could. Anyway, and I'm a PhD candidate at University of Fairbanks. So I'm going to read my paper, and it's oral tradition in the U.S. Congress for the. So these are the books that were at the library. People are digitizing things, so sometimes the real book is no longer there. And the Alaska Native people's voices continue to be heard in the United States Congress and across the country because they used one of their most powerful tools of survival, their oral tradition of speaking, whether it is teaching in their home village, visiting another village, or the United States Congress. One of the goals Alaska Native people strove for in the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, known as ANCSA, was to keep their land. Entwined with their land is their connection to their way of life and survival for time immemorial, the time frame many indigenous peoples used to describe their existence on Earth and beyond. People who had never left their villages and their land were now in front of the United States Congress, testifying to their way of life on their lands. Their testimony has been recorded in the Alaska Native Claims hearings before the 90th Congress. So my first quote is from Frank Degnan, who's from Unalakleet. He said, "I have no copy with me. We keep this in our brains, don't have any records." It was oral tradition of the Alaska Native people that changed history. Before the Transatlantic Alaska Pipeline Act was signed into law was the time of testimony before the United States Congress by the Alaska Native people. The United States congressional hearings were needed after the land freeze on the state of Alaska. The reason they had the land freeze, it was to provide information to make decisions about land and monetary compensation. This is where the Alaska Native people excelled, as they were well prepared for oral testimony. It was 1968, and the land freeze was placed on all Alaska lands. The land freeze had been declared by the United States Secretary of Interior, Stuart Udall. When Alaska became a state, it meant that the state of Alaska owned the land, and with their ownership came their plans to sell rights and lands to oil companies and mining companies interested in mineral extraction and other resources. The state of Alaska had plans for their land that did not include Alaska Natives. The situation turned around when the federal government acknowledged that a fair and equitable agreement was needed to be made between Alaska Native people, the federal government, and the state of Alaska to recognize the land ownership and claims of the Alaska Native people. U.S. Secretary Udall decided that by freezing the lands, the state, the federal government, and the Alaska Native people would be given the chance to decide a fair and equitable agreement before there is any distribution of the land. In 1968, Emil Nati was the president of the Alaska Federation of Natives. In his congressional testimony on July 12, 1968, on a panel with Mr. Hensley, Mr. Borbridge, and several other representatives from Alaska, he told Congress that they agreed that the land freeze imposed by Udall was aimed at the interests of the Alaskan Native people. At that time, land was needed to build the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, and the land freeze put a halt to that. From 1966 to 1971, the Alaska Federation of Natives worked towards achieving their goals and securing the land claim settlement. In December 1971, Congress passed the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, ANCSA. Then the state and oil companies could move forward, as well as the Alaska Native people. President Nixon, on November 16, 1973, signed into law the Trans-Alaska Pipeline Act, Senate Bill 1082, that finalized permission to build the Trans-Alaska Pipeline Act and finalized permission to build proposed by the House 361 to 14. And this is, in Washington, D.C. Frank Degnan, quoted in the opening epigraph of this paper, gave his short explanation of oral tradition of Alaska Native people when Congress asked him if he had a written statement. Degnan was one of many Alaska Native people who went to Washington, D.C. to testify before Congress. The usual procedure for testifying was to submit a written statement as well as giving a brief oral introduction and explanation of the purpose of their statement. This paper shares some of the testimony during the period of time before ANCSA when Alaska Native people stood before Congress and spoke. In the pages of U.S. congressional hearings during the late 1960s is recorded Alaska Native testimony that described a way of life that Alaska Native people lived and how it was changed forever. We are still learning from the teachings through the oral and written testimony of Alaska Native people who left their villages, many for the first time, to testify before Congress. Most people bring a prepared written statement, but there are a few exceptions, such as Frank Degnan, Alaska, who spoke without the written document. Following is a brief biographical sketch of Frank Ovnu Degnan. Ovnu, meaning cottonwood bark in Inupiaq, is Frank Degnan's Inuit name. His grandfather, also named Ovnu, was one of the last of the truly Inuit chiefs whose life spanned the end of the Russian era in Alaska and ushered in the new era of American intrusion into Northwest Alaska. Frank Degnan began leadership roles as a young man. He wanted all Native people to pursue their rights and be aware of what they could accomplish. We were asleep when this happened, but today we are awake. Frank was also one of the founding delegates of the Alaska Federation of Natives. On May 18, 1975, the University of Alaska Fairbanks bestowed an honorary doctorate of public service to Frank Degnan. Another excerpt from Frank Degnan. No matter what bill you introduced, they make corrections and they go along, and then the type of that is the funny thing. During the First World War, they said that if you do not like your Uncle Sam, you can go back to your home by the sea. If the Eskimos would sing it the other way, what would happen? Maybe we could get foreign aid then, but just the same, one major said to me, "Frank, I've heard this a long time. I've heard this, go home Yankees." You know what I said? "You're not putting words into my mouth," I said. "You're not the one that said it." And that was Degnan speaking. This conversation was during the questioning period after his testimony when Senator Gruening asked him if he approved of the bill. Degnan agreed some parts were all right, but not all the parts. His answer above seems to echo something that was told to him, which was similar to, "If you do not like it, you can go home," a common saying. He has been told that, so when the Alaska Native people say it back, Frank Degnan points out, It is what was said to them by Uncle Sam. Degnan also makes a comment at the beginning of his testimony regarding Eskimos. At this time in history, the Alaska Native people were referred to as Eskimos, and in some testimony, they also use that term regarding themselves. Frank Degnan also uses it, but points out in the beginning of his testimony, Governor Egan has fought for us. He fought harder than the Eskimos. We are not Eskimos. We are Inupiat. That is what we are. Somebody invented Eskimos. At the time of the hearings, Alaska Native people were referred to as belonging to three groups: Eskimo, Aleut, and Indians. Several of the Alaska Native people giving testimony used these names because at this time their focus was on land claims, and that is what they spoke about. In the Alaska Native Claims hearings on July 12, 1968, several topics regarding land were introduced, such as national forests, conservation and recreation, natural resources, and public land for state purposes. It was the voices of the Alaska Native people that brought the hearings back to the subject of the land they owned and their way of life. They needed the land to live on, fish and hunt on, grow food on, and have access to the land's resources. Their testimony was the focus of the hearings during the land freeze. Another support to them was the oil industry that knew they could not go forward until the Alaska Native Claims Act. Alaska Native claims were settled. I'm just not saying who's in these photos. I'm hoping you could read it. Flora Lekanoff Sr. was born on St. George Island, Alaska in 1926. In 1942, during World War II, because of the geographical location, he was sent to an internment camp in southeast Alaska. He attended high school in Tacoma, Washington, and continued on with college in Spokane, then the University of Washington, where he received his MA in public school administration, later becoming a teacher and school principal. He organized the Cook Inlet Native Association, as well as being a founding member of the Alaska Federation of Natives. In Flora Lekanoff Sr.'s testimony, he spoke about blood quantum. At that time, you needed more than 1/4 native blood to receive any benefits. Because his region included so many isolated islands, he expressed that it would not be fair to those who lived as Native people and considered Native people to be excluded. The long history of intermarriages from outside cultures should not dissuade the benefits that would be available, especially to those who lived and upheld the Native culture and language and had relatives and family that were Alaska Native people. Another focus of his testimony was housing. Flora Lekanoff begins with a history of Aleut traditional housing and the changes it went through in his lifetime. This testimony is related to the testimony of Laura Burkt, who described housing at the time for Alaska Native people. The background that Flora Lekanoff tested to gave us an understanding of Laura Burkt's testimony. We are attempting to show that the Native people of Alaska lived in dwellings that were satisfactory to them and to their environment before the White Man Act set foot on the Native country. Same can be said in regards to the Indian people before the white man invasion of his country. With this introduction of the Judeo-Christian philosophy way of life, the problem of housing began. This was first of all started with the family concept of the new philosophy, one man, one night, one wife, one house idea. I am not saying that the idea is wrong, but that the means to achieving it is wrong. The new philosophy did not provide the adequate means. As a result of this conflict, we have the housing problem of the Native people. And that's a quote. And he goes on, with the white men of the last half century, there came to the Arctic the white men's lofty and commodious frame dwellings. Although these are thoroughly ill-adapted to the country, they soon became the fashion. Driftwood lay in apparently inexhaustible windrows along the seashore. but these were the accumulations of centuries which the Eskimo, having no use for wood as fuel, had allowed to grow. The description explains the loss of driftwood that has not been explained before. The supplies could not be replenished in one season, and this caused a shortage because driftwood was used for other cultural reasons. Another repercussion from using frame houses was that the unique design of native dwellings included constant ventilation. When seal oil was used to heat rather than wood, ventilation was a great preventive of respiratory diseases. There was an above vent as well as the door opening vent that flushed the air through the dwelling, and the sod walls were designed to keep the heat in. Housing conditions became a serious problem and exasperated people's health for survival against pulmonary diseases such as pneumonia and tuberculosis. And that was part of Lekanoff's testimony. And the book that I showed in the beginning had Lekanoff's name in it. It was his book that he had after this was done. But I tried to find that book when I was here, but I think it's gone. Should have gone to the museum. Alaska Native people who had an average age at death as 34 years of age. Laura Burke wanted changes and improvements for Alaska Native people, as did many of the people testifying. Laura Burke's testimony, and then that's Laura Burke. The typical Alaska Native home is small, about 12 by 24 feet on the average. It is dark, cold, and poorly ventilated during the long winter. There are often 10 and 12 persons, mostly children, living in that one room. Fuel is costly, water is scarce, and usually hard to come by. During the winter, ice and snow are melted and consumed without prior boiling or chlorination. This is after the changes. That is what she's observed. Among other topics that Berg addressed was education, health, and hospitals. Having read Lekanoff's description of the change to the Judeo-Christian philosophy and his description of why it did not work for the Alaska Native people, gave a greater understanding of the change from a vibrant and successful way of life to one of hardship and poverty. It was acknowledged by Senator Metcalf when he stated, "I think you have added to the very startling statement that Secretary Udall made that poverty in Alaska is beyond the conception of poverty among the American Indians in the lower 48. At first I thought this was insulting the way of life of Alaska Native people, but Lekanoff's words described how Alaska Native housing went from environmentally appropriate to extreme conditions of being not appropriate to ways that affected people's health and welfare. The hearings brought with them the answers to questions about how rich, healthy cultures of Alaska Native people met their demise by their efforts to colonize, as was requested by missionaries and the government. And this is Squindy Fred Paul, another Alaska Native person who testified at the 90th Congress hearings was William L. Paul, Sr., according to the Sealaska Foundation. William L. Paul was a gifted orator, Alaska's first Native attorney, the state's first Native legislator, and a formidable warrior who fought on the front line of many legal and political battles of his time. Squindy William L. Paul, Sr. was born on May 7, 1885, at Tongass Village in southeast Alaska. He was a raven of the Tehitan clan. He attended the Carlisle Indian School and then earned a BA from Whitworth College and a law degree from LaSalle University. He was a founder of the Alaska Native Brotherhood, which was the first Native American civil rights organization in the nation. Paul was 84 when he addressed the 90th Congress with an oral testimony, unwritten. He spoke last at the hearing about a combination of ideas he thought of while listening to the Alaska Native testimony. His testimony included For instance, in the problem of quantum of blood, why do we have to go on an administrative body who exercises judicial functions in order to determine whether I belong to a tribe or do not belong to a tribe, or my children or my grandchildren? Why do they have to be excluded from participating in enjoyment of the property which under our law descends from one generation to another, and why does it result in complications? Nevertheless, it has worked for thousands of years. Why not let the common law do it? When you come right down to it, the Indians have their own common law too. We are the ones who decide who is a member of the tribe, and we have Supreme Court decisions to that effect. The last person to be mentioned among the many Alaska Native people that testified is Etok, Charles Edwardson, Jr. He was born in Barrow and attended the United States with his brilliance, the Congress, with his brilliance and dedication to the Alaska Native people. Etok carried his message throughout the United States. He described his work to Congress and the world, where the Alaska Native people stood in their ownership of their lands and the action they needed to take to ensure that the Alaska Native people were represented before the U.S. Congress. He spoke of the people's rights and needs and worked on the laws to be passed that benefited the people. Quoting from the Alaska News Dispatch are examples of the history of Alaska Native people he changed with his knowledge by expressing his ideas before Congress. Ivan Peter, a vice chancellor at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, stated, "He was a major influence not only in my life, but for a generation of young Alaska Native leaders." Etok said, "I became a problem for the school for the simple fact that I did not like what was going on." He said years later, he didn't like the food or being forced to stay on school grounds. Etok Charles Edwardson, his testimony follows. "What I would like to observe is the total social, political, economic community of America as it reflects the difficult problems of Alaska. Most of these laws, and 95% of our laws, are made here in Washington. We have a few outside hearings, and all of us have certain ecological problems and also sociological problems. But the very framework of our political institution, that is 99% of the time it was advantageous to the politicians of America to suppress and oppress the American Indian. This was the climate, and at that time, my people were new to the institutional value structure of America. They were kept out. In these past few years, we have changed. Otherwise, I hope to show a faith in our form of government that I still think that if our senators in Congress work a little bit harder, I think that we can get this legislation passed." Senator Metcalf at the land claim hearings commented on Etok Charles Edwardson's testimony. "Mr. Edwardson, the Political Science Department of Western Washington State College must be a quite remarkable place in view of the statement you have made and the statement you have incorporated. Thank you very much." And Etok was a remarkable man and dedicated to the Alaska Native people. In February 1970, AFN President Emil Nati, while lobbying in Washington State, delivered a speech that attracted attention. He said that if Congress passed a bill that did not grant the natives an acceptable land base, they should seek a new solution. They should petition for a separate nation in Western Alaska. At that time, AFN obtained a loan from the Yakima Indian Nation for lobbying purposes. For several years, Donald Wright, president of the Cook Inlet Native Association, led the negotiations with Robert Jim, president of the Yakima Indian Nation. And here's President Nixon signing the bill. And the cover of the Tundra Times. and Nora, with Hashuka, our ancestors. At a time when schools and curriculum writers are including Alaska Native history, the congressional hearings are an excellent background. They show what the Alaska Native leaders were saying and doing to preserve the Alaska Native way of life. In a presentation in Southeast Alaska, Willie Hensley told us that many Alaska Native people asked him why more was not done, and he explained that the Alaska Native people came very close to losing more, and it was with swift organization of the different Native people and their testimony that preserved some land. Many of the people testifying spent their own money or money pooled from the villages so that Alaska Native people had representation at the Congress in the United States Senate. And then my conclusion is that I would just have a brief. It's with sadness that many of these great Alaska Native leaders are learned about by reading their obituaries, except for us, because we got to hear Emo, and he's still here. I concur that the history curriculum in all schools in Alaska and elsewhere teach about some of the powers of Congress that include changing laws and give examples, such as the Alaska Native Claims Act and the work put in to get the act passed by some of the greatest orators in the United States. And that's the end. Okay, so questions.
So questions and comments. I'll take the microphone to the questioner or commenter so that the video capture by KTOO will catch the audio. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Oh, I never know how to hold these things. Thanks, Elizabeth. Was this your dissertation or your...
No, my dissertation is about potatoes.
Oh. Plinkett potatoes. Yes, okay.
April. Maybe April, and I could send a link to listen to it.
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm too jumpy. Thank you, Alice. What motivated you to do this research?
Oh, thanks, Alice. I had a class that was with Teresa John, oral. It was an oral history class. And then another class with Diane Benson, who's very politically motivated in teaching. And between those two classes, I still have a friend, Marie Olson, and we did cook something up over at her dining room table where the testimony I was going to have other people read so that it wasn't just me reading. So we would have, she was going to read Laura Burke because, that's Laura Burke was on the Tonight Show, and that's Marie, so, and then we would have a couple different people, maybe Lance Twitchell or, some other people where we actually had the voices of the people. And that was it, 2015. I have notes from 2015 when I wrote the research. And then she knew all these people. Because Marie Olson. Because she was down in San Francisco during the taking of Alcatraz, and she would bump into ETOG. So I heard all the stories of the people behind that.
Thank you.
Elizabeth, thank you for your work, and what a beautiful jacket.
This jacket is going to Janice Criswell, Steve Henriksen's. She didn't make it. It was made by Dorothy Grant, and Dorothy Grant's having a retrospective show at the State Museum, and then this is going to be in that, and then, you know, I gave it to Janet, but I think it'll be too big for her, so, but we don't know. But anyway, so it's Haida, so it's going away, you know, to the museum where you could go see it on a show there. So it's terrific. Thank you.
I'm interested in how people raise the money, you know, to get people to Washington, D.C. Can you talk about that a little bit? I mean, it seemed like it was important for a while.
No, when I was reading, it just said that the villages and people, you know, raised money, and then other tribes, you know, like the Yakima Indian, gave them a huge amount of money to lobby and do things like that. Then, you know, Marie had also said that people would share a room, and the Alaska Native people would, you know, all be crammed into a, you know, okay, you've got a hotel room, we're going to come and stay at your room instead of, you know, paying for it. So, you know, one person, so they all shared together, and this was, you know, the whole state, so there's a lot of, you know, combination of people that could help raise money.
And to that question, Shakshani Margaret Dutson, who was living in Juneau at the time, told me that there were a group of people who went house to house and asked, can you give anything, even a quarter, to help with the land claims?
Yeah, because that's what he was saying at the end, that we could have lost everything, you know, because people are criticizing, you know. And the other people's names that are in this are contemporary. Amos Alter, who is from Juneau, he's an engineer, because people, during the 50s, 1950s, there was a very big, it's like not an outbreak, because you've got to get tuberculosis from other people. So the new way was like put everybody in a classroom, no ventilation, keep everybody warm. And the 5th grade class in Juneau had really high numbers of tuberculosis. And then Elfrida Nord, who's a nurse, but she was also master's in public health, and then Dr. Fortine. So that was in the 50s. You figure this is 1968, so this is in a very recent past. That's what they were talking about, the housing. That's how the housing, you know, kind of created more problems.
And you mentioned Marie Olson, who is now living here in the Pioneer Home, and she'll be 100 in November. Huchaway. Gunnastish to cut Johan for coming.